It's a great privilege to be invited. As John said, I was a colleague of Michael Frader's for 14 years. It was tremendous for Oxford to have a scholar and teacher of his eminence. I won't go into anecdotes about seminars I attended that he gave. He gave classes in a wide range, but I just want to mention one extra thing, that Michael attracted the best young scholars to Oxford or to wherever it was he was teaching. This further enhanced the intellectual life in Oxford, and he gave them extraordinary attention and guidance. That's going to be vaguely relevant to the topic of my lecture. I came up with this topic thanks to reflections forced on me by the pandemic and the experience of lockdown. Now, in addition to the pandemic, we have the war with Ukraine, causing global shortages of energy and food. But my focus is going to be on individuals, not on the pros and cons of autarky for an economy. I have put something on your reading list at the back of the handout if you're interested in that. It is crucial to have the handout and also crucial that you can hear me. So please do let me know in the salon if you can't hear me. And those of you online, if you have a problem, please message John, who will sort things out. Self-sufficiency, autarkeia, was highly valued, especially but not only in the philosophical writers. My inquiry focuses on Aristotle's discussions of happiness, or the happy life, primarily in the Nicomachean Ethics. The discussions make crucial use of the claim that happiness must be self-sufficient. It seems to have been regarded as axiomatic that the highest good must be something autarkes. The claim played an important role in Plato's Philebus, where they conduct a search for the highest good. Is it pleasure or knowledge? The conclusion is that neither of these leading candidates on its own can be the highest good, since each lacks autarkeia, Philebus 67a9. So some mixture of the two wins first prize. So Aristotle inherited the idea that the highest good must possess autarkeia. The puzzle that's the starting point for my lecture is this. It's well known that in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle has two discussions of eudaimonia, seemingly arriving at different conclusions. In both, his argument makes important appeal to the criterion of self-sufficiency. The correct answer to the question, what is eudaimonia, must show that it's self-sufficient, according to his treatment. But he offers a different gloss or account of what it is for happiness, or the happiest life, to be self-sufficient in the two treatments. And that's part of what allows him to come up with two different answers. Let me quickly sketch the background, though it'll be familiar to many of you. In his search for what is happiness or the best life, Aristotle consistently argues that it consists in energeia, activity, not merely a state, and it's closely connected to arete, virtue or excellence. His famous formula is that it's activity in accordance with or manifesting virtue, energeia kat aretein. And he goes on to divide the virtues into those of character, the moral virtues, and those of the intellect. The impression we get from book one is that the best life will be one displaying both types of virtue, the moral and the intellectual virtues, not least because of the way he develops the claim that eudaimonia will be complete and self-sufficient. So I'll come to the way he develops the claim shortly. And he devotes much of the work to the ethical virtues, including especially justice. He also allows that happiness requires some external goods, one subject to fortune, though these are given a minor role. His list of the so-called external goods, by the way, includes good birth, good looks, and good children. You can't be happy without these. Though some external goods are necessary, the chief component of a person's happy life is their exercise of the virtues. But when he comes back to the question in book 10 of what activity is the best and happiness, he rather unexpectedly selects just one of them, the excellent intellectual activity he calls theoria. You'll find different translations: contemplative activity, study, contemplation, but I'll mostly stick to theoria. He insists it's different from inquiry, rather it's somehow surveying abstract theoretical subject matter. It's a difficult question what exactly he envisaged the activity to be, but that's not my concern now. He offers a number of arguments to the conclusion that the best activity is theoria. Each of them is designed to show, this is in book 10, that it ranks more highly than any of the other excellent activities, in particular than the exercise of the moral virtues. And this is a bit surprising. So now back to my puzzle. In both treatments, he insists that a key marker of eudaimonia is that it's something self-sufficient, but he gives quite different accounts of what it is to be self-sufficient, as I've indicated on your handout. And the difference underpins the very diverse answers to the question, what is eudaimonia? Worse still, there seems to be a direct contradiction between the ways he spells out the notion of self-sufficiency. Text 1 offers a rather abstract characterization of the self-sufficient as that which on its own makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. He'll go on to say that eudaimonia is most choice-worthy, not being counted as one good among others. On the interpretation I favor, the so-called inclusive view, it's a very controversial matter, as I'm sure you know, this amounts to saying that eudaimonia is a composite of the best goods. I'm calling that a broad gloss on the term autarkes because of the phrase, that which on its own makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. But it's also important to note that first Aristotle says what he doesn't mean by the term, and this is on your T1, we don't mean that which is sufficient for a man by himself, for one who lives a solitary life, but also that which is sufficient, but also for parents, children, wife, and in general for his friends and fellow citizens, since man is born for citizenship. Here he appeals to his famous dictum that man is a politikon zoon, suited to live in a polis. Now look at the very different account that we get in book 10, the claim that theoria is the best and so happiest activity. See text 2a. And by the way, there's a typo in the reference there. It should be 1177, A27. For the self-sufficiency that's spoken of must belong most to contemplative activity. For while a philosopher, a sophos, as well as a just man or one possessing any other virtue, needs the necessaries of life, when they've been adequately equipped with things of that sort, the just man, in addition, needs people towards whom and with whom he shall act justly, and the temperate man, the brave man, and so on. But the philosopher, even when by himself, can contemplate truth, and the better, the wiser he is. Perhaps he can do so better if he has fellow workers, but still he is the most self-sufficient. So the message is, everyone needs the necessaries of life, but those who devote themselves to morally good activities need more than that, viz. People towards whom and with whom to be just, brave, and so on, while the philosopher can do his thing all by himself. Text 2b adds a different but related point. You have extra needs if you're to practice the moral virtues, resources to be generous or just with, for instance. Then some even more bizarre claims about the extra needs: power for the brave, dunamis, and opportunity, i.e. presumably temptations to resist, for the moderate person. By contrast, the philosopher has no such needs. Well, two comments here. First, as I've already said, there's a direct contradiction when 2a labels the need for others as diminishing the self-sufficiency of the activity, since in T1, as we saw, Aristotle explicitly said he didn't mean to pick out a solitary life. And second, aren't these pretty ridiculous reasons to describe certain activities as not self-sufficient, and therefore to mark them down in the contest for which is the happiest way of life? You need others to be kind or generous to, or you need opportunities to display your moderation. I find these claims frankly shocking. How can the same criterion of self-sufficiency be glossed in such different ways and with such different results? That's what I'm going to go on to investigate, but first a preliminary point. Aristotle uses the adjective to qualify different things. In text 1, happiness is said to be autarkeia. In text 2, first it's used of the activity of pharia, and then at the end of the passage, we find it used in a more familiar way to qualify types of people as more or less self-sufficient. We'll need to look at how these uses are related and to include another familiar one whereby a polis is claimed to be self-sufficient. I've spoken of the two different ways Aristotle glosses the term when he applies the term to happiness or the happiest life. And for the time being, I'm just going to call these the expansive or broad account in book 1 and the narrow one in book 10. I don't want to speak of different meanings of the term because I think it has a single core meaning, that of lacking nothing or needing nothing. See text 1 and all the entries in section 4 on the self-sufficiency of God. A person or a way of life or a city can be said to lack nothing or to need nothing, but this can be in two importantly different ways. Actually, there are a lot of ways, but these are the relevant ones. Something can be said to need or lack nothing, either by having all their needs fulfilled or by having the minimum of needs in the first place. The expansive or broad gloss allows something to be self-sufficient, provided it's supplied with everything needful, and that can be a lot. On the narrow understanding, something self-sufficient, i.e. needing or lacking nothing, by having few or no needs in the first place. So the basic meaning, lacking nothing or needing nothing, allows of these very different ways of satisfying the requirement. Let me just give you a homely explanation of that. During lockdown, my kind neighbor messaged me from time to time saying she was doing an online shop and should she order anything for me. Now, sometimes I would reply, thank you very much, but I don't need anything. Of course, I didn't mean I'm not in need of groceries or household goods. What I meant was, I've got everything I need for now, thank you very much. So let's take olive oil. Let's say I don't need olive oil because I've got a lot in the store cupboard. But something else like dishwasher tablets, I don't need if I haven't got a dishwasher. I have no need for them. So these are very different ways of satisfying the requirement. There are some further important connotations to mention when it comes to calling a person or a polis self-sufficient. It's often implied it's not enough to have all one's needs fulfilled, all one's wants supplied, to be autarkeia. It matters that the entity, person or polis, is securely in that position. In some contexts, being self-sufficient for a person or for a city requires not just that their wants are all supplied, so that they lack nothing, but they can count on remaining so, or even better, that they themselves can ensure they remain so. This requirement is part of what prompts the slide from the broader understanding of self-sufficient, having everything we want or need, to the narrow one. Because although you may be very well equipped with everything you need and can rely under normal circumstances to continue to be in that favorable position, all this may change in some unfortunate circumstance, such as a tsunami, a war, or a pandemic. My aim is to try to explain how in the Niketh, Aristotle can segue from the broader explication of the self-sufficiency of happiness to the narrow one he invokes in Book 10. This extra requirement for personal self-sufficiency, or that of a polis, of being secure against the need for external input, may be part of the answer. The notion that God is self-sufficient and the way in which that's understood will also play quite a big part. Section 2 of your handout has some passages connecting self-sufficiency to the polis, but because we started late, I'm not going to discuss them, though we can talk about it a bit in the Q&A if you'd like. So I'll move on to section 3, which presents a few passages in which an individual or a type of person is described as self-sufficient. In text 6, the fragment of Democritus, and 7a from the Memorabilia, we get the notion of self-sufficiency as being able to manage with very little in the way of bodily comforts or pleasures. This was the kind of self-sufficiency that the Cynics later embraced. Think of Diogenes and his barrel, or was it a wine jar? Extreme disregard for bodily comforts. And by the way, I must apologize for the fact that apart from mentioning the Cynics and Epicurus right at the end, I'm not going to pursue the topic of self-sufficiency in post-Aristotelian writers, though it is a topic of very great interest. In 7d, the end of the Memorabilia, Xenophon concludes his praise of Socrates by remarking on his independence of judgment. This manner of being autarkes is another respect in which the Cynics followed Socrates. Here, to be self-sufficient is to be completely independent in one's judgments of good and bad, not relying on any other standard or on anyone else. So it's not to need anyone else in a very specific sphere, that of arriving at one's judgments of right and wrong. It would be quite a different matter not to need anyone else at all for anything. And we sort of begin to approach that in text 9, which is especially important because of its extreme interpretation of what it is for a person to be self-sufficient. It comes from the stretch of Plato's Republic, where Socrates is discussing the education of the would-be guardians. He makes the scandalous suggestion that they should remove, or should we say cancel, certain parts of Homer from the curriculum, as he believes they'll have a bad effect on impressionable youths. The wider context of text 9 is Socrates demanding that the poetry the young are exposed to shouldn't contain any depictions of men grieving, for instance, when a companion dies in battle. But in the extract I've given you at T9, Socrates goes much further than that. Not only will the best brought up young men not display grief at such an occurrence, they won't feel it either, because a loss such as this won't be a terrible thing. When it comes to living well, the good man is most self-sufficient and has markedly less need than others of another person. So he, least of anyone, will find it terrible to lose a son or a brother or money or anything else like that. What's particularly chilling about this is the way Socrates casually links losing a son or a brother with losing money. None of these will be found terrible by the good person because he has no need of any of them. And all of this, Socrates claims, follows from the supposed self-sufficiency of the good and hence happy man. It's a very important text for our study because it goes far beyond a fairly standard view that for a person to be self-sufficient is for them not to need to rely on goods, help, or services from others, or for them to have a minimum need of such services. What Plato makes Socrates say here takes the idea of not needing another person to a quite different level. Incidentally, Socrates proposes that while it should be forbidden to depict famous men indulging in grief, the kind of lamentations he deplores can be ascribed to women, only not noble ones, because that will make the behavior unappealing to those educated to avoid it. Well, that's just a little aside. Finally, in texts T10 and T11, we have two extracts from other parts of the Nicomachean Ethics. In these, Aristotle isn't discussing the high-flown topic of eudaimonia and how it is self-sufficient, but is describing a type of person as self-sufficient and justifying what he says about them with reference to that epithet. What's notable about these passages, one about the megalopsuchos and one about the king, is that in each case a rather grand person is described as self-sufficient, thanks in part to having great wealth, which he uses in the correct way, not to enrich himself further or to make more profit out of it, but in the case of the king to benefit his subjects. So I've given you a little summary on the handout of the different ways in which a person can be said to be self-sufficient. So moving on to section 4, with its texts about the self-sufficiency of God. Though interestingly, the ones I've put on the handout don't use that term, but rather home in on the idea that God needs nothing or lacks nothing. That this is so came to be accepted by intellectuals in the 5th century, it seems, in the wake of Xenophanes' revisionary theology. Xenophanes, you'll remember, attacked the notion of human-like gods behaving in unseemly ways and substituted a far more abstract notion of the divinity in no way similar to mortals in body or in thought. Euripides puts the same thought, that God needs nothing, into the mouth of Heracles with his protests against Theseus's appeal to traditional stories about the gods. So it evidently came to be a commonplace that God is self-sufficient and needs nothing. But remember the different ways in which that can be understood. God could be in need of nothing because he's already in possession of everything good, rather as the Olympians were. Or much more likely in the new intellectual climate, God is described as needing or lacking nothing because of the nature of God. It's in the nature of God to require and enjoy nothing other than what his own nature supplies. When Aristodemus in the Memorabilia says the Godhead is too grand to need service from him, we can assume he's not thinking that the Godhead's needs for Therapeia are satisfied with his contribution, rather that God stands in no need of Therapeia at all. And that issue, whether God needs any service from us, and if so, of what kind, is also prominent in Plato's Euthyphro. Socrates, you may remember, ties Euthyphro in knots over his claim that piety is a part of justice concerning Therapeia of the gods. In the case of God, then, with this understanding of God's nature, there's no gap between the two understandings of autarkeia, the broad one in which something needs nothing because it's already securely supplied with everything desired or necessary, and the narrow one in which to need nothing is to have virtually no needs at all. The new conception of the Godhead's nature as completely self-contained means there's only one way in which God is self-sufficient. The broad and the narrow understanding coincide. God has everything he needs precisely because he needs nothing. Of course, this created a problem for traditional ideas of service and sacrifices to the gods, and we find philosophers such as Plato struggling with the issue in the Euthyphro and later in the Laws. When I return shortly to give a closer look at the wider contexts of the shocking passages at the end of Book 10, that was text 2a and 2b, we'll see that the comparison with God is very much on Aristotle's mind. But before I do that, I'm turning to Aristotle's struggles with an old problem he inherited from Plato's Lysis. That short work is full of mainly unsolved puzzles about love and friendship. And the one we have here at your text 17 was to be very influential. I'll just read out the beginning where the problem lies. The good person, qua good, is sufficient to himself, hikanos hauto. Hence he needs nothing. Be on your guard. In both the Niketh and the Eudeth, Aristotle devotes a lot of space to the topic of friendship and its place in the good life. He's adamant that friendship and the having of friends is a necessary component of happiness, but he gives a lot of attention in both works to the puzzle he inherited from Plato. Text 18 contains his statement of the problem, and unlike the version we get in the Lysis, it explicitly appeals to the alleged self-sufficiency of the blessed person. So I need to find text 18 here and read the beginning of it to you. It's also disputed whether the happy person will need friends or not. It's said that the supremely happy and self-sufficient, the makarioi, will have no need of friends, for they have the things that are good, and therefore, being self-sufficient, they need nothing further. A good and blessed person needs nothing further traditionally, because to count as blessed, they already have everything that's needful. So it's simply a fallacy to conclude that the good person won't need friends. Though Aristotle doesn't point this out, in effect, his question must be understood as my quotation from Cooper at the top of page 4 of your handout indicates. The question he's really trying to ask is whether the having of friends is a necessary constituent of a flourishing life. The idea that the happy person is self-sufficient shouldn't be allowed to cast doubt on that, provided we remember the broad understanding of what it is to be self-sufficient. It's hard to think what could count as a proof that the best life includes friendship and activities involving friendship and activities involving friends, philoi in the very wide sense that Aristotle uses it, family, colleagues, fellow citizens. In marshalling the dialectical points in favor of a happy person needing friends, Aristotle, I'm glad to say, is willing to state the obvious. At text 19, little Roman 3, it would be absurd to make the makarios person solitary. No one would choose to have all the goods but live a solitary life. For man is political and born to live together with others. Though he presents this as a dialectical argument, as something people say, it really goes to the heart of the matter. But Aristotle, in fact, goes on to present his highly convoluted and labored argument to the conclusion he's looking for, starting from the idea that a friend is another self, an argument I'm very glad to pass over. Instead, I want to draw some points from the Eudemian ethics treatment of the same issue. This also starts from the notorious move from self-sufficiency to having no needs of friends. Text 20, and backs this up with an appeal to God. Since he lacks nothing, he'll not need a friend. By now, I hope you're alert to the fallacy here. From the mere fact that God lacks nothing, it doesn't follow that he won't need a friend, only that he has all that he needs. So if he needs friends, he has them. But no sooner have we said that, than its absurdity is obvious because of the supposed nature of God. And as text 21 from later in the chapter shows, Aristotle can make that point very clearly. We went wrong in making the comparison with God. Because God's not of such a nature to need friends, we made the same claim of the one who's like him, that is the best and happiest humans. But he continues, and this is text 21, a few lines in, But if one followed this line of argument, one would say that a virtuous man does not think of anything because that's not what makes God happy. Being as he is too grand, Beltion, to think of anything except himself. The reason is that for us, well-being involves something other than ourselves, whereas he is his own well-being. Exactly how we should understand the contrast between God's thinking and ours isn't very clear, at least not to me. Well, I think I understand, but I'm not going to go into it now. The key point comes in the last line. For us, our good is kath heteron, while God is his own well-being. The good, that is happiness for us, requires more than our own nature provides for us, but for God it doesn't. So now I can return to the shocking claims about self-sufficiency and happiness in Book 10. In Book 1, you remember when Aristotle appealed to the demand that happiness be self-sufficient, he gave a broad account of what that entailed and explicitly remarked that he didn't entail it to involve living a solitary life. But in Book 10, while he still demands that the happiest life or activity be self-sufficient, he now gives that a quite different gloss, so that an activity needing other people, even if only as recipients of our good deeds, is less self-sufficient and therefore less happy. How did it come to this? Well, the supposed self-sufficiency of the activity of theoria is only one of several arguments Aristotle uses to argue that it's the best and thus happiest activity. He starts with the claim that nous, our reason or rational faculty, is the best part of us because its objects, roughly the eternal and necessary truths, are the best objects. He excludes practical rationality here from what counts as nous, and to the claim that theoria is God's sole activity. Indeed, with some touches of humor, he insists that it's false and indeed vulgar to attribute any of the ethical virtues and their associated activities to the gods. This isn't on your handout, it's from 10:8, so I'll read it out. We assume the gods to be above all other things blessed and happy, but what sorts of actions must we assign to them? Acts of justice? Will not the gods seem absurd if they make contracts and return deposits and so on? Or liberal acts, to whom will they give? And so on. In effect, Aristotle's arguing from God's presumed happiness and his supposed nature, he has no bodily desires, no interactions with others that would fit with the ethical virtues of justice and so on. Anything to do with actions is trivial and unworthy of the gods. But everyone supposes the gods are active and alive, so the only activity available to them is theoria, and therein lies God's happiness. What bearing does this have on human happiness? Well, he claims the activities of humans that's most akin to this godlike activity will, more than any others, be happy. This argument is based entirely on claims about divine nature, activity, and happiness. It makes no appeal to self-sufficiency. But now we return to the two arguments that come just before these remarks about God's nature and happiness, the ones that form my initial puzzle at 2a and 2b, the ones which mark down any activity other than contemplation as lacking in self-sufficiency. They're using the narrow notion of self-sufficiency, I suggest, precisely because it fits the manner in which God's life and activity and God himself are understood to be self-sufficient, having no needs at all. Now, as we saw in text 21, Aristotle was able to argue that because God's nature is different from ours, we, unlike God, need relationships with others as parts of our happiness. But here in NE10, he argues in the opposite direction. Gods are supremely happy. Their only activity is contemplation, since their nature precludes any of the fine, specifically human activities. So contemplation must also be the happiest and best activity for human beings insofar as they're capable of it. So here's the weak point as I see it. Back in text 2a, he's explicitly appealing to the agreed thesis that happiness is self-sufficient. But that needs the broad understanding of self-sufficient as lacking nothing. But to mark down a life of excellent activities involving other people and to promote in the happiness stakes theoria with its minimum need of resources and none of other people, he must be invoking a new, narrow understanding of having no needs at all. But that's quite inappropriate as an understanding when being self-sufficient is a mark of happiness or happiest activity. I've suggested in mitigation that the shift from the broader to the narrower gloss on self-sufficiency, from having everything you need to not needing anything external to the thing itself, can be explained in the case of God, according to the conception of God Aristotle's taken for granted. For God and for God's happiness, the two notions coincide. Well, I embarked on this inquiry because I'd always found Aristotle's claims about the self-sufficiency of theoria puzzling and disturbing. Given that self-sufficiency was an accepted criterion for happiness, how could Aristotle have reached the conclusion that a person's activity is the more self-sufficient and hence superior, the less it involves other people? I think I've arrived at some kind of answer to that question, as I've indicated, but the upshot is that we get nothing in the way of practical guidance about the kinds of self-sufficiency we should cultivate in our own lives. Being able to thrive on a fairly modest lifestyle is no doubt good, maybe good in itself, but certainly a prudent course of action in case of a downturn in our fortunes, as the quotation from Epicurus in my postscript neatly indicates. What about dependence on other people, on loved ones, or simply on company? To be able to keep oneself well occupied when forced to live a solitary life due to lockdown or some other circumstance is no doubt valuable. It's good to be able to make the best of a bad job or a bad turn of events. But I'm not at all inclined to accept Aristotle's view that activities that intrinsically involve nothing and no one except oneself and one's rationality are more self-sufficient if that entails being superior, happier. There's not much good and nothing intrinsically good about that sort of self-sufficiency other than for God. Thank you.